Hello again. Under the current Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, the murder rate in the capital has been rising dramatically. I thought that it might be of interest to look at murders which involve knives and see who is actually involved in such crimes. Can we work out what is driving the terrible crime rate? So far this year, 12 teenagers have been stabbed to death in London. Now, I am well aware that even 60 or 70 years ago, young men would carry knives, and once in a while they would use them to stab somebody. In the 50s, there were the Teddy Boys with their flick knives, and then came the mods and rockers and the skinheads. The weapons brandished by members of these gangs in those days were really just waved around for show. It was very, very rare for anybody actually to be knifed, and even rarer for murder to be committed by young people in this way. A knifing which resulted in death would be front page news in those days. How very different is the situation today. It's only April, and yet already 12 teenagers have been stabbed to death in London. The latest boy to die was 18, and shockingly, his own brother was stabbed to death just 4 years ago in pretty much the same circumstances. In the thumbnail to this video, you can see the names and pictures of all the victims, and you don't have to look hard to see that none of them are of English origin. It's the same picture with other stabbings which are of older people. Both victims and those accused of their murders are not white British. This is odd in a city where about half the inhabitants are white British. Let me give a few examples of older people stabbed to death in London this year. On January the 11th, 48-year-old Leon Street was stabbed to death in Neasden. A man called Amin Laoua was charged with his murder. 2 days later, Paul Bolton was stabbed to death in Wimbledon. Mongo Belili was charged with his murder. Later that month, 2 Lithuanians called Dainius Kalboka and Jonas Semilas, both 145, were murdered, and Vytautas Garmas, another Lithuanian who's 51, was charged with their murders. On January the 24th, Tiparat Agatu, aged 48, was killed in Whitechapel. February the 6th, Sven Badzak, 22, stabbed to death in Willesden. The day after Lavon Witter, who is black, was murdered in Croydon. 10 days later, 37-year-old Jack Ampadu was stabbed to death, and Dwayne Stewart Ackers, 37, was charged with his murder. I wonder if a pattern is emerging here. The pattern that I see is that all these murders seem to be committed by either foreigners or the children and grandchildren of immigrants. It is vanishingly rare for any ordinary white British person to stab another to death, but alarmingly common for black people and foreigners to do so. Nobody likes to talk about this, and we all have to pretend that there are other circumstances which lead to this sort of tragedy. There is surely a connection between this and the fact that the police are more likely to stop and search young black men than they are white people or those of South Asian origin. The fact is that white British people are extremely unlikely to be going out to stab somebody in the street, but it is definitely a thing associated with some communities. I have to remark that if any left-wing white people or black militants are concerned that black lives matter, then they might reflect that the people taking black lives in London are not racist police officers, but rather other black people. I'm not sure why no one wants to discuss this. It possibly accounts for the fact that these murders are still taking place at an increasing rate. Until we start facing facts, it's going to be impossible to do anything about them.